Suitonius, the 12 Caesars. Part 1, Julius Caesar. Picking up Section 49. The only specific charge of unnatural practices ever brought against him was that he had been King Nicomedes' bedfellow, always a dark stain on his reputation and frequently quoted by his enemies. Licinius Calvus published the notorious verses. The richest of Bithynia's king, who Caesar on his couch abused. Dolabella called him the queen's rival, an inner partner of the royal bed, and Curio, the elder, Nicomedes, Bithynia's brothel. Bibulus, Caesar's colleague in consulship, described him in an edict as the queen of Bithynia, who once wanted to sleep with a monarch but now wants to be one. And Marcus Brutus recorded that about the same time one Octavius, a scatterbrained creature who would say the first thing that came into his head, walked into a packed assembly where he saluted Pompey as king and Caesar as queen. Moreover, Gaius Memmius directly charges Caesar with having joined a group of Nicomedes' debauched young friends at a banquet where he acted as the royal cupbearer, and adds that certain Roman merchants whose names he supplies were present as guests. Cicero, too, not only wrote in several letters. Caesar was led by Nicomedes' attendants to the royal bedchamber, where he lay on a golden couch dressed in a purple shift. So this descendant of Venus lost his virginity in Bithynia. But also once interrupted Caesar while he was addressing the house in defense of Nicomedes' daughter Nysa, and listing his obligation to Nicomedes himself. "Enough of that," Cicero shouted, "if you please. We all know what he gave you and what you gave him in return." Lastly, when Caesar's own soldiers followed his decorated chariot in the Gallic triumph, chanting ribald songs, as they were privileged to do, this was one of them. Gaul was brought to shame by Caesar. By King Nicomedes he. Here comes Caesar, wreathed in triumph, for his Gallic victory. Nicomedes wears no laurels, though the greatest of the three. His affairs with women are commonly described as numerous and extravagant. Among those of noble birth whom he is said to have seduced were Servius Sulpicius, wife Postuma, Aulus Gabinius, wife Lollia, Marcus Crassus's wife Tertulla, and even Pompey's wife Mucia. Be this how it may, both Curio the elder and Curio the younger reproached Pompey for having married Caesar's daughter. Footnote. Julia. End of footnote. When it was because of Caesar, whom he had often despairingly called Augustus. Footnote. The lover of Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra. End of footnote. That he divorced Mucia, mother of his 3 children. But Marcus Brutus' mother, Servilia, was the woman whom Caesar loved best, and in his first consulship he brought her a pearl worth 60,000 gold pieces. He gave her many presents during the Civil War, as well as knocking down certain valuable estates to her at a public auction for a song. When surprise was expressed at the low price, Cicero made a neat remark. It was even cheaper than you think, because a third, Tertia, had been discounted. Servilia, you see, was also suspected at the time of having prostituted her daughter, Tertia, to Caesar. That he had love affairs in the provinces, too, is suggested by another of the ribald verses sung during the Gallic triumph. Home we bring our bold whoremonger. Romans lock your wives away. All the bags of gold you lent him went his Gallic tarts to pay. Among his mistresses were several queens, including Eunoia, wife of Bogudes the Moor, whom, according to Marcus Actorius Naso, he loaded with presents. Bogudes is said to have profited equally. The most famous of these queens was Cleopatra of Egypt. He often feasted with her until dawn, and they would have sailed together in her state barge to Ethiopia, had his soldiers consented to follow him. He eventually summoned Cleopatra to Rome, and would not let her return to Alexandria without high titles and rich presents. He even allowed her to call the son whom she had borne him by his own name. Footnote: Caesarion. Ptolemy XV, Caesar. End of footnote. Some Greek historians say that the boy closely resembled Caesar in features as well as in gait. Mark Antony informed the Senate that Caesar had in fact acknowledged Caesarion's paternity, and that other friends of Caesar's, including Gaius Matius and Gaius Oppius, were aware of this. Oppius, however, seems to have felt the need of clearing his friend's reputation, because he published a book to prove that the boy whom Cleopatra had fathered on Caesar was not his at all. A tribune of the people named Helvius Cinna informed a number of people that, following instructions, he had drawn up a bill for the commons to pass during Caesar's absence from Rome, legitimizing his marriage with any woman or woman he pleased, for the procreation of children, and to emphasize the bad name Caesar had won a leg for unnatural and natural vice. I may here record that the elder Curio referred to him in a speech as every woman's man and every man's woman. Yet not even his enemies denied that he drank abstemiously. An epigram of Marcus Cato's survives. Caesar was the only sober man who ever tried to wreck the Constitution, and Gaius Oppius relates that he cared so little for good food that when once he attended a dinner party where rancid oil had been served by mistake, and all the other guests refused it, Caesar helped himself more liberally than usual, to show that he did not consider his host either careless or boorish. He was not particularly honest in money matters either while a provincial governor or while holding office at Rome. Several memoirs record that as governor in Spain, he not only begged his allies for money to settle his debts, but wantonly sacked several Lusitanian towns, though they had accepted his terms and opened their gates to welcome him. In Gaul, he plundered large and small temples of their votive offerings, and more often gave towns over to pillage because their inhabitants were rich than because they had offended him. As a result, he collected larger quantities of gold than he could handle and began selling it for silver in Italy and the provinces at 3,000 sestertii to the pound, which was about 2/3 of the official exchange rate. In the course of his first consulship, he stole 3,000 pounds of gold from the capital and replaced it with the same weight of gilded bronze. He sold alliances and thrones for cash, making King Ptolemy the 11th of Egypt give him and Pompey nearly 1,500,000 gold pieces, and later paid his civil war army and the expenses of his triumphs and entertainments by open extortion and sacrilege. Caesar equaled, if he did not surpass, the greatest orators and generals the world had ever known. His prosecution of Dolabella unquestionably placed him in the first rank of advocates, and Cicero, discussing the matter in his Brutus, confessed that he knew no more eloquent speaker than Caesar, whose style is chaste, pellucid, and grand, not to say noble. Cicero also wrote to Cornelius Nepos, "Very well, then. Do you know any man who, even if he has consecrated on the art of oratory to the exclusion of all else, can speak better than Caesar? Or anyone who makes so many witty remarks? Or whose vocabulary is so varied and yet so exact?" Caesar seems to have modeled his style, at any rate, when a beginner, on Caesar Strabo, part of whose defense of the Sardinians he borrowed verbatim for use in a trial oration of his own. He was then competing with other advocates for the right to plead a cause. It is said that he pitched his voice high in speaking and used impassioned gestures, which far from displeased his audience. Several of Caesar's undoubted speeches survive, and he is credited with others that may or may not have been his. Augustus said that the speech for Quintus Metellus could hardly have been published by Caesar himself, and that it appeared to be a version taken down from shorthand writers who could not keep up with his rapid delivery. He was probably right, because on examining several manuscripts of this speech, I find that even the title is given not as for Metellus, but as for a speech composed for Metellus, although Caesar's purported to deliver it in defense of Metellus and himself against a joint accusation. Augustus also doubted the authenticity of Caesar's address to my soldiers in Spain. It is written in two parts, one speech supposedly delivered before the first battle, the other before the second, though on the latter occasion, at least according to Asinius Pollio, the enemy's attack gave Caesar no time to address his troops at all. He left memoirs of his war in Gaul and of his civil war against Pompey, but no one knows who wrote those of the Alexandrian, African, and Spanish campaigns. Some say that it was Oppius, others that it was Hirtius, who also finished the Gallic War, left incomplete by Caesar, adding a final book. With regard to Caesar's memoirs, Cicero also, in the Brutus, observes, "Caesar wrote admirably. His memoirs are cleanly, directly, and gracefully composed, and divested of all rhetorical trappings." And while his sole intention was to supply historians with factual material, the result has been that several fools have been pleased to primp up his narrative for their own glorification. But every writer of sense has given the subject a wide berth. Hirtius says, downrightly, "These memoirs are so highly rated by all judicious critics that the opportunity of enlarging and improving on them, which he purports to offer historians, seems in fact withheld from them, and, as his friend, we admire this feat even more than strangers can. They appreciate the faultless grace of his style. We know how rapidly and easily he wrote." Asinius Pollio, however, believes that the memoirs show signs of carelessness and inaccuracy. Caesar, he holds, did not always check the truth of the reports that came in, and was either disingenuous or forgetful in describing his own actions. Pollio adds that Caesar must have planned a revision. Among his literary remains are 2 books of an essay on analogy, 2 more of answers to Cato, and a poem, The Journey. He wrote an essay on analogy while coming back over the Alps after holding assizes in Cisalpine Gaul. Answers to Cato in the year that he won the Battle of Munda, and The Journey during the 24 days he spent on the road between Rome and further Spain. Many of the letters and despatches sent to him to the Senate also survive, and he seems to have been the first statesman who reduced such documents to book form. Previously, consuls and governor-generals had written right across the page, not in neat columns. Then there are his letters to Cicero, and his private letters to friends, the more confidential passages of which he wrote in cipher. To understand their apparently incomprehensible meaning, one must number the letters of the alphabet from 1 to 22, and then replace each of the letters that Caesar has used with the one which occurs 4 numbers lower. For instance, D stands for A. It is said that in his boyhood and early youth he also wrote pieces called In Praise of Hercules and the Tragedy of Oedipus, and collected sayings. But nearly a century later, the Emperor Augustus sent Pompeius Macer, his surveyor of libraries, a brief, frank letter forbidding him to circulate these minor works. Caesar was a most skillful swordsman and horseman, and showed surprising powers of endurance. He always led his army, more often on foot than in the saddle, went bareheaded in sun and rain alike, and could travel for long distances at incredible speed in a gig, taking very little luggage. If he reached an unfordable river, he would either swim or propel himself across it on an inflated skin, and often arrived at his destination before the messengers whom he had sent ahead to announce his approach. It is disputable a point which was the more remarkable when he went to war, his caution or his daring. It is a disputable point which was the more remarkable. He never exposed his army to ambushes, but made careful reconnaissances, and refrained from crossing over into Britain until he had collected reliable information about the harbors there, the best course to steer, and the navigational risks. On the other hand, when news reached him that the camp in Germany was being besieged, he disguised himself as a Gaul and picked his way through the enemy outposts to take command on the spot. He ferried his troops from Brundusium to Dyrrhachium in the winter season, running the blockade of Pompey's fleet, and one night, when Antony had delayed the supply of reinforcements despite repeated pleas, Caesar muffled his head with a cloak and secretly put to sea in a small boat alone, and incognito forced the helmsman to steer into the teeth of a gale, and narrowly escaped shipwreck. Religious scruples never deterred him for a moment. At the formal sacrifice, before he launched his attack on Scipio, the king Juba, the victim escaped, but he marched off at once. He had also slipped and fallen as he disembarked on the coast of Africa, but turned an unfavorable omen into a favorable one by shouting, "Africa, I have tight hold of you than to ridicule the prophecy according to which it was the Scipio's fate to be perpetually victorious in Africa. He took about with him a contemptible member of the Cornelian branch of the Scipio family, nicknamed Salvito, or Greetings. But off with him, being a mockery of his way of life. Sometimes he fought after careful tactical planning, sometimes on the spur of the moment, at the end of a march, often or in miserable weather, when he would be least expected to make a move. Towards the end of his life, however, he took fewer chances, having come to the conclusion that his unbroken run of victories ought to sober him, now that he could not possibly gain more by winning yet another battle than he would lose by defeat. It was his rule never to let enemy troops rally when he had routed them, and always, therefore, to assault their camp at once. If the fight were a hard-fought one, he used to send the chargers away, his own among the first, as a warning that those who feared to stand their ground need not hope to escape on horseback. This charger of his, an extraordinary animal with feet that looked almost human, each of its hooves was cloven in 5 parts, resembling human toes, had been foaled on his private estate. When the soothsayers pronounced that its master would one day rule the world, Caesar carefully reared and was the first to ride the beast, nor would it allow anyone else to do so. Eventually he raised a statue to it before the temple of Mother Venus. If Caesar's troops gave ground, he would often rally them in person, catching individual fugitives by the throat and forcing them round to face the enemy again, even if they were panic-stricken, as when one standard-bearer threatened him with the sharp butt of his eagle, and another, whom he tried to detain, ran off, leaving the eagle in his hand. Caesar's reputation for determination is fully borne out by the instances quoted. After Pharsalus, he had sent his legions ahead of him into Asia, and was crossing the Hellespont in a small ferryboat, when Lucius Cassius, with 10 naval vessels, approached. Caesar made no attempt to escape, but rowed towards the flagship and demanded Cassius's surrender. Cassius gave it, and stepped aboard Caesar's craft. Again, while attacking a bridge at Alexandria, Caesar was forced by a sudden enemy sortie to jump into a rowboat. So many of his men followed him that he dived into the sea and swam 200 yards until he reached the nearest Caesarian ship, holding his left hand above water the whole way to keep certain documents dry, and towing his purple cloak behind him with his teeth, to save this trophy from the Egyptians. He judged his men by their fighting record, not by their morals or social position, treating them all with equal severity and equal indulgence, since it was only in the presence of the enemy that he insisted on strict discipline. He never gave forewarning of a march or a battle, but kept his troops always on the alert for sudden orders to go wherever he directed. Often he made them turn out when there was no need at all, especially in wet weather or on public holidays. Sometimes he would say, "Keep a close eye on me," and then steal away from camp at any hour of the day or night, expecting them to follow. It was certain to be particularly long march, and hard on stragglers. If rumors about the enemy's strength were causing alarm, his practice was to heighten morale, not by denying or belittling the danger, but on the contrary, by further exaggerating it. For instance, when his troops were in a panic at the news of King Juba's approach, he called them all he called them together and announced, "You may take it from me that the king will be here in a few days, at the head of 10 infantry legions, 30,000 cavalry, 100,000 lightly armed troops, and 300 elephants. This being the case, you may as well stop asking questions and making guesses. I have given you the facts, with which I am familiar. Any of you who remain unsatisfied will find themselves aboard a leaky hulk, and being carried across the sea wherever the winds may decide to blow them." Though turning a blind eye to much of their misbehavior, and never laying down any fixed scale of penalties, he allowed no deserter or mutineer to escape severe punishment. Sometimes, if a victory had been complete enough, he relieved the troops of all military duties, and let them carry on as wildly as they pleased. One of his boasts was, "My soldiers fight just as well when they are stinking of perfume." He always addressed them not as "my soldiers," but as "comrades," which put them into a better humor, and he equipped them splendidly. The silver and gold inlay of their weapons both improved their appearance on parade and made them more careful not to get disarmed in battle, these being objects of great value. Caesar loved his men dearly. When news came that Titurius's command had been massacred, he swore neither to cut his hair nor to trim his beard until they had been avenged. By these means he won the devotion of his army, as well as making it extraordinarily brave. At the outbreak of the Civil War, every centurion in every legion volunteered to equip a cavalryman from his savings, and the private soldiers unanimously offered to serve under him without pay or rations, pooling their money so that nobody should go short. Throughout the entire struggle, not a single Caesarian deserted, and many of them, when taken prisoners, preferred death to the alternative of serving with the Pompeians. Such was their fortitude in facing starvation and other hardships, both as besiegers and as besieged, that when Pompey was shown at Dyrrhachium the substitute for bread, made of grass, on which they were feeding, he exclaimed, "I am fighting wild beasts." Then he ordered the loaf to be hidden at once, not wanting his men to find out how tough and resolute the enemy were, and so lose heart. Here the Caesarians suffered their sole reverse, but proved their stout-heartedness by begging to be punished for the lapse, whereupon he felt called upon to console rather than upbraid them. In other battles they beat enormously superior forces. A single company of the 6th Legion held a redoubt against 4 Pompeian legions for several hours, though almost every man had been wounded by arrow shot. 130,000 arrows were afterwards collected on the scene of the engagement. This high level of courage is less surprising when individual examples are considered, for the centurion Cassius Scavina, Scaeva, blinded in one eye, wounded in thigh and shoulder, and with no less than 120 holes in his shield, continued to defend the approaches to a redoubt. Nor was his by any means an exceptional case. At the naval battle of Massilia, a private soldier named Gaius Achillius grasped the stern of an enemy ship, and when someone lopped off his right hand, nevertheless boarded her and drove the enemy back with the boss of his shield only, a feat rivaling that of the Athenian Cynergius, brother of the poet Aeschylus, who showed similar courage when maimed in trying to detain a Persian ship after the victory at Marathon. Caesar's men did not mutiny once during the Gallic War, which lasted 10 years. In the civil wars they were less dependable, but whenever they made insubordinate demands, he faced them boldly and always brought them to heel again, not by appeasement, but by sheer exercise of personal authority. At Placentia, although Pompey's armies were as yet undefeated, he disbanded the entire 9th Legion with ignominy, later recalling them to the colors in response to their abject pleas. This with great reluctance, and only after executing the ringleaders. At Rome, too, when the 10th Legion, agitated for their discharge and bounty, and were terrorizing the city, Caesar defied the advice of his friends and at once confronted the mutineers in person. Again he would have disbanded them, though the African war was still being hotly fought. But by addressing them as citizens, he readily regained their affections. A shout went up. "We are your soldiers, Caesars, not civilians." And they clamored to serve under him in Africa, a demand which he nevertheless disdained to grant. He showed his contempt for the more disaffected soldiers by withholding a third part of the prize money and land which had been set aside for them. Even as a young man, Caesar was well known for the devotion and loyalty he showed his dependents. While praetor in Africa, he protected a nobleman's son named Macintha against the tyranny of Hyempsal, king of Numidia, with such devotion that in the course of the quarrel he caught Juba, the Numidian heir apparent, by the beard. Macintha, being then declared the king's vassal, was arrested, but Caesar immediately rescued him from the Numidian guards and harbored him in his own quarters for a long while. At the close of his praetorship, Caesar sailed for Spain, taking Macintha with him, the lictors carrying their rods of office, and the crowds who had come to say goodbye acted as a screen. Nobody realized that Macintha was hidden in Caesar's litter. He showed consistent affection to his friends. Gaius Oppius, traveling by his side once through a wild forest, suddenly fell sick, but Caesar insisted on his using the only shelter that offered, a woodcutter's hut, hardly large enough for a single occupant, while he and the rest of the staff slept outside on the bare ground. Having attained supreme power, he raised some of his friends, including men of humble birth, to high office, and brushed aside criticism by saying, "If bandits and cutthroats had helped to defend my honor, I should have shown them gratitude in the same way." Yet, when given the chance, he would always cheerfully come to terms with his bitterest enemies. He supported Gaius Memenius' candidature for the consulship, though they had both spoken most damagingly against each other. When Gaius Calvus, after his cruel lampoons of Caesar, made a move towards reconciliation through mutual friends, Caesar took the initiative by writing him a friendly letter. Valerius Catullus had also libeled him in his verse about Mamurra. Footnote: Catullus, Poems 29 and 57. End of footnote. Yet Caesar, while admitting that these were a permanent blot on his name, accepted Catullus's apology and invited him to dinner that same afternoon, and never interrupted his friendship with Catullus's father. Caesar was not naturally vindictive, and if he crucified the pirates who had held him to ransom, this was only because he had sworn in their presence to do so, and he first mercifully cut their throats. He could never bring himself to take vengeance on Cornelius Fagita, even though, in his early days, while he was sick and a fugitive from Sulla, Cornelius had tracked him down night after night and demanded large sums of hush money. On discovering that Philemon, his slave secretary, had been induced to poison him, Caesar ordered a simple execution without torture. When Publius Clodius was accused of adultery with Caesar's wife Pompeia in sacrilegious circumstances, and both her mother-in-law Aurelia and her sister-in-law Julia had given the court a detailed and truthful account of the affair, Caesar himself refused to offer any evidence. The court then asked him why, in that case, he had divorced Pompeia. He replied, "Because I cannot have members of my household accused or even suspected." Nobody can deny that during the Civil War and after he behaved with wonderful restraint and clemency, whereas Pompey declared that all who were not actively with the government were against it and would be treated as public enemies. Caesar announced that all who were not actively against him were with him. He allowed every centurion whom he had appointed on Pompey's recommendation to join the Pompeian forces if he pleased. At Ilerda in Spain, the articles of capitulation were being discussed between Caesar and the Pompeian generals Afranius and Petreius, and the rival armies were fraternizing when Afranius suddenly decided not to surrender and massacred every Caesarian soldier found in his camp. Yet Caesar could not bring himself to pay Afranius back in the same coin. During the battle of Pharsalus, he shouted to his men, "Spare your fellow Romans," and then allowed them to save one enemy soldier apiece, whoever he might. My researches show that not a single Pompeian was killed at Pharsalus once the fighting had ended, except Afranius and Faustus and young Lucius Caesar. It is thought that not even these three were killed at his instance, though Afranius and Faustus had taken up arms again after he had spared their lives, and Lucius Caesar had cruelly cut the throats of the dictator's slaves and freedmen, even butchering the wild beasts brought by him to Rome for a public show. Eventually, towards the end of his career, Caesar invited back to Italy all exiles whom he had not yet pardoned, permitting them to hold magistracies and command armies, and went so far as to restore the statues of Sulla and Pompey, which the city crowds had thrown down and smashed. He also preferred to discourage rather than punish any plots against his life, or any slanders on his name. All that he would do when he detected such plots, or became aware of secret nocturnal meetings, was to announce openly that he knew about them. As for slanderers, he contented himself with warning them in public to keep their mouths shut, and good-naturedly took no action against either Aulus Caecina for his most libellous pamphlet, or against Pitholaus for his scurrilous verses. Yet other deeds and sayings of Caesar's may be set to the debit account, and justify the conclusion that he deserved assassination. Not only did he accept excessive honors such as a life consulship, a life dictatorship, or perpetual censorship, the title imperator, but before his name, and the title Father of his country appealed to it, also a statue standing among those of the ancient kings, and a raised couch placed in the orchestra at the theater, but took other honors, which as a mere mortal he should certainly have refused. These included a golden throne in the Senate House, and another on the Tribuna, a ceremonial chariot, and litter for carrying his statue in the religious procession around the circus, temples, altars and divine images, a priest of his own cult, a new college of Lupercals to celebrate his divinity, and the renaming of the 7th month as July. Few, in fact, were the honors which he was not pleased to accept or assume. His 3rd and 4th consulship were merely titular. The dictatorship conferred on him at the same time supplied all the authority he needed, and in both years he substituted 2 new consuls for himself during the last quarter, meanwhile letting only tribunes and aediles of the people be elected and appointing prefects instead of praetors to govern the city during his absence. One of the consuls died suddenly on New Year's Eve, and when someone asked to hold office for the remaining few hours, Caesar granted his request. He showed equal scorn of traditional precedent by choosing magistrates several years ahead, decorating 10 former praetors with the emblems of consular rank, and admitting to the Senate men of foreign birth, including semi-civilized Gauls who had been granted Roman citizenship. He placed his own slaves in charge of the mint and the public revenues, and sent one of his favorites, a freedman's son, to command the 3 legions stationed at Alexandria. Titus Ampius has recorded some of Caesar's public statements which reveal a similar presumption that the Republic was nothing, a mere name without norm, without form or substance, that Sulla had proved himself a dunce by resigning his dictatorship, and that now his own word was law. People ought to be more careful how they approached him. Once, when a soothsayer reported that a sacrificial beast had been found to have no heart, an unlucky omen indeed, Caesar told him arrogantly, "The omens will be more favorable when I wish them to be. Meanwhile, I am not at all surprised that a beast should lack the organ which inspires our finer feelings." What made the Romans hate him so bitterly was that when one day the entire Senate, armed with an imposing list of honors that they had just voted him, came to where he sat in front of the temple of Mother Venus, he did not rise to greet them. According to some accounts, he would have risen had not Cornelius Belbus prevented him. According to others, he made no such move and grimaced angrily at Gaius Trebatius, who suggested this courtesy. The case was aggravated by a memory of Caesar's behavior during one of his triumphs. He had ridden past the benches reserved for the tribunes of the people, and shouted in fury at a certain Pontius Aquila, who had kept his seat. "Hey there, Aquila, the tribune! Do you want me to restore the Republic?" For several days after this incident, he added to every undertaking he gave, with the kind consent of Pontius Aquila. This open insult to the Senate was emphasized by an even worse example of his arrogance. As he returned to Rome from the Alban Hill, where the Latin festival had been celebrated, a member of the crowd set a laurel wreath bound with a royal white fillet on the head of his statue. 2 tribunes of the people, Epidus Marullus and Cestius Flavus, ordered the fillet to be removed at once, and the offender imprisoned. But Caesar reprimanded and summarily deposed them both, either because the suggestion that he should be crowned king had been so rudely rejected, or else because this was his own version. They had given him no chance to reject it himself, and so earned deserved credit. From that day forward, however, he lay under the odious suspicion of having tried to revive the title of king, though indeed When the commons greeted him with "Long live the king," he now protested, "No, I am Caesar, not king." And though again, when he was addressing the crowd from the rostra at the Lupercalian festival, and Mark Antony, the consul, made several attempts to crown him, he refused the offer each time, and at last sent the crown away for dedication to Capitoline Jupiter. What made matters worse was a persistent rumor that Caesar intended to move the seat of government to Troy or Alexandria, carrying off all the national resources, drafting every available man in Italy for military service, and letting his friends govern the city. At the next meeting of the House, it was further whispered, Lucius Cotta would announce a decision of the 15 who had charge of the Sibylline books, that since these prophetic writings stated clearly, only a king can conquer the Parthians, the title of king must be conferred on Caesar. So, because his enemies shrank from agreeing to this proposal, they pressed on with their plans for his assassination. Several groups, each consisting of 2 or 3 malcontents, now united in a general conspiracy. Even the commons had come to disapprove of how things were going, and no longer hid their disgust at Caesar's tyrannical rule, but openly demanded champions to protect their ancient liberties. When foreigners were admitted to the Senate, someone put up a poster which read, "Long live our country." Footnote. Bonum, factium, seat a formula prefixed to edicts. End of footnote. But if any newly appointed senator inquires the way to the Senate House, let nobody direct him there. And the following popular song was sung everywhere. Caesar led the Gauls in triumph, led them uphill, led them down. To the Senate House he took them, once the glory of our town. Pull those breeches off, he shouted, change into a purple gown. As Quintus Maximus, one of the 3 months' consuls, entered the theater, the lictor called out as usual, "Make way for the consul." Cries of protest went up. "What? For him? He's no consul." The deposition of Cessatius and Marullus caused such widespread annoyance that at the next consular elections the commons cast a great many votes in their favor. Someone then wrote on the pedestal of Lucius Brutus' statue, "If only you were alive now," and on that of Caesar himself. Brutus was elected consul when he sent the kings away. Caesar sent the consuls packing. Caesar is our king today. More than 60 conspirators banded together against him, led by Gaius Cassius and Marcus and Decimus Brutus. A suggested plan was to wait until the consular elections, when Caesar would take his stand on the wooden bridge along which voters walked to the poll. One group of conspirators would then topple him over, while another waited underneath with daggers drawn. An alternative was to attack him in the sacred way or at the entrance to the theater. The conspirators wavered between these plans until Caesar called a meeting of the Senate in the Pompeian Assembly Room for the Ides of March. They then decided at once that this would be a convenient time and place. Unmistakable signs forewarned Caesar of his assassination. A few months previously, the veterans who had been sent to colonize Capua under the Julian law were breaking up some ancient tombs in search of stone for their new farmhouses, all the more eagerly when they came across a large hoard of ancient vases. One of these tombs proved to be that of Capys, founder of the city, and there they found a bronze tablet with a Greek inscription to this effect: "Disturb the bones of Capys, and a man of Trojan stock will be murdered by his kindred, and later avenged at great loss to Italy. This story should not be dismissed as idle fiction or a lie, because our authority for it is none other than Cornelius Bulbus, a close friend of Caesar's. Soon afterwards news reached Caesar that a herd of horses, which he had dedicated to the river Rubicon, after fording it, and allowed to roam untended in the valley, were beginning to show a repugnance for the pasture and shedding bucketfuls of tears. Again, during a sacrifice, the augur Spurina warned Caesar that the danger threatening him would not come later than the Ides of March, and on the day before the Ides, a little bird called the kingbird flew into the hall of Pompey with a sprig of laurel in its beak, pursued by a swarm of different birds from a nearby copse, which tore it to pieces there and then. And on his last night, Caesar dreamed that he was soaring above the clouds and then shaking hands with Jupiter, while his wife, Calpurnia, dreamed that the gable ornament resembling that of a temple, which had been one of the honors voted him by the Senate, collapsed, and there he lay, stabbed in her arms. She awoke suddenly, and the bedroom door burst open of its own accord. These warnings and ill health made him hesitate for some time whether to go ahead with his plans or whether to postpone the meeting. Finally, Decimus Brutus persuaded him not to disappoint the Senate, who had been in full session for some time, waiting for him to arrive. It was about 10 o'clock when he set off for the house. As he went, someone handed him a note containing details of the plot against his life, but he merely added it to the bundle of petitions in his left hand, which he intended to read later. Several victims were then sacrificed, and despite consistently unfavorable omens, he entered the house, deriding Spurina as a false prophet. "The Ides of March have come," he said. "Yes, they have come," replied Spurina, "but they have not yet gone." As soon as Caesar took his seat, the conspirators crowded around him as if to pay their respects. Tullius Cimber, who had taken the lead, came up close, pretending to ask a question. Caesar made a gesture of postponement, but Cimber caught hold of his shoulders. "This is violence," Caesar cried, and at that moment, as he turned away, one of the Casca brothers, with a sweep of his dagger, stabbed him just below the throat. Caesar grasped Casca's arm and ran it through with his stylus. He was leaping away when another dagger blow stopped him. Confronted by a ring of drawn daggers, he drew the top of his gown over his face, and at the same time ungirded the lower part, letting it fall to his feet, so that he would die with both legs decently covered. 23 dagger thrusts went home as he stood there. Caesar did not utter a sound after Casca's blow had drawn a groan from him, though some say that when he saw Marcus Brutus about to deliver the second blow, he reproached him in Greek with, "You too, my child?" The entire Senate then dispersed in confusion, and Caesar was left lying dead for some time until 3 slave boys carried him home in a litter, with one arm hanging over the side. The physician, Antistius, conducted the post-mortem and came to the conclusion that none of the wounds had been mortal except the second one, in the chest. It had been decided to drag the dead man down to the Tiber, confiscate his property, and revoke all his edicts. But fear of Mark Antony, the consul, and Lepidus, the master of horse, kept the assassins from making their plans good. At the request of Lucius Piso, Calpurnia's father, Caesar's will, which he had drafted 6 months before at his villa near Lavacum, and entrusted to the safekeeping of the chief vestal, was unsealed and read in Antony's house. From the time of his first consulship until the outbreak of the civil war, according to Quintus Tubero, Caesar's principal heir had been his son-in-law Pompey, and he used to read out this part of his will to the assembled troops. In his last will, however, he cancelled the bequest and left 3/4 of his estate, after certain legacies had been deducted, to Gaius Octavius, afterwards Augustus, and 1/8 each to Lucius, Pinarius, and Quintus Pedius. These were the 3 grandsons of his sister. At the close of the will, he also adopted Gaius Octavius into the Caesar family, but provided for the possibility of a son being subsequently born to himself, and appointed several of the assassins as guardians to the boy. Decimus Brutus even figured among his heirs in the 2nd degree. Footnote: those who would inherit if the heirs in the 1st degree were prevented by death or unwillingness from accepting the legacy. End of footnote. Caesar left the general public his gardens on the banks of the Tiber for use as a recreation ground, and 3 gold pieces a man. When the funeral arrangements had been announced, his friends raised a pyre on the Campus Martius near his daughter Julia's tomb, and a gilded shrine on the rostra, resembling that of Mother Venus. In it they set an ivory couch spread with purple and gold cloth, and from a pillar at its head hung the gown in which he had been murdered. Since a procession of mourners laying funeral gifts would have taken more than a day to file past the pyre, everyone was invited to come there by whatever route he pleased, regardless of precedents. Emotions of pity and indignation for Caesar's murder were roused at the funeral games by a line from Pacuvius's play Contest for the Arms of Achilles. What did I save these men that they might murder me? And by a similar sentiment from Attilius's Electra, Mark Antony dispensed with a formal eulogy. Instead, he instructed a herald to read first the recent decree simultaneously voting Caesar all divine and human honors, and then the oath by which the entire Senate had pledged themselves to watch over his safety. Antony added a very few words of comment. When the ivory funeral couch had been carried down into the forum by a group of magistrates and ex-magistrates, and a dispute arose as to whether the body should be cremated in the temple of Capitoline Jupiter or in Pompey's assembly hall, 2 divine forms suddenly appeared, 2 javelins in their hands and sword at thigh, and set fire to the couch with torches. Immediately the spectators assisted the blaze by heaping on it dry branches, and the judges' chairs, and the court benches, with whatever else came to hand. Thereupon the musicians and professional mourners who had walked in the funeral train wearing the robes that he had himself worn at his 4 triumphs, tore these in pieces and flung them on the flames, to which veterans who had assisted at his triumphs added the arms they had then borne. Many women in the audience similarly sacrificed their jewelry together with their children's breast plaques and robes. Public grief was enhanced by crowds of foreigners lamenting in their own fashion, especially Jews, who came flocking to the forum for several nights in succession. As soon as the funeral was over, the populace, snatching firebrands from the pyre, ran to burn down the houses of Brutus and Cassius, and were repelled with difficulty. Mistaking Helvius Cinna for the Cornelius Cinna, who had delivered a bitter speech against Caesar on the previous day, and whom they were out to kill, they murdered him and paraded the streets with his head stuck on the point of a spear. Later, they raised a substantial, almost 20-foot-high column of Numidian marble in the Forum, and inscribed on it, "To the Father of his country." For a long time afterwards they used to other sacrifices at the foot of this column, make vows there, and settle disputes by oaths taken in Caesar's name. Some of his friends suspected that, having no desire to live much longer because of his failing health, he had taken no precautions against the conspiracy and neglected the warnings of soothsayers and well-wishers. It has also been suggested that he placed such confidence in the Senate's last decree and in their oath of loyalty that he dispensed even with the armed Spaniards who had hitherto acted as his permanent escort. A contrary view is that, as a relief from taking constant precautions, he deliberately exposed himself just this once to all the plots against his life which he knew had been formed. Also, he is quoted as having often said, "It is more important for Rome than for myself that I should survive. I have long been sated with power and glory, but should anything happen to me, Rome will enjoy no peace. A new civil war will break out under far worse conditions than the last." Almost all authorities agree on one thing, that he more or less welcomed the manner of his death. He had once read in Xenophon's Boyhood of Cyrus the paragraph about the funeral instructions given by Cyrus on his deathbed, and said how much he loathed the prospect of a lingering end. He wanted a sudden one, and on the day before his murder he had dined at Marcus Lepidus' house, where the topic discussed happened to be the best sort of death. "And let it come swiftly and unexpectedly," cried Caesar. He was 55 years old when he died, and his immediate deification, formally decreed, was more than a mere official decree, since it reflected public conviction, if only because, on the first day of the games given by his successor Augustus in honor of this apotheosis, a comet appeared about an hour before sunset and shone for 7 days running. This was held to be Caesar's soul elevated to heaven, hence the star, and now placed above the forehead of his divine image. The Senate voted that the assembly hall where he fell should be walled up, and the Ides of March should be known ever afterwards as the day of parricide, and that a meeting of the Senate should never take place on it again. Very few, indeed, of the assassins outlived Caesar for more than 3 years, or died naturally. All were condemned, and all perished in different ways, some in shipwreck, some in battle, some using the very daggers with which they had murdered Caesar to take their own lives. End of Part 1, Julius Caesar, by Suitonius.